Hi, welcome to Business and Finance. Obviously, we're starting off here with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 really is just an introduction to the overall kind of content of the course. I wouldn't worry too much about specific exam questions on this chapter, but a lot of the things that we're going to see are then going to be built upon as we move our way further on. So it's obviously important that we build a good understanding, a good kind of foundation of knowledge before we move on. The very first thing that we're going to look at is a definition of what an organization actually is. Now, I'm sure you guys have some idea of what we mean by organization, but we've got here a specific definition that we're going to try and pick apart and try and use a couple of different examples to really show you exactly what we mean. So what do we mean by an organization? Well, an organization is anywhere where you have a social arrangement for controlled performance of collective goals, and there's some sort of boundary separating the organization from its environment. Now underneath we've picked that definition apart, and in order to show you how this fits two very different organizations, we've chosen a big car manufacturer like Ford, and we've chosen the Army. So two very different organisations, and we can just pick apart the key parts of the definition we've just seen, and we can see how then that's going to fit for these two different organisations. Okay, so the first part of the definition then was social arrangement. Now, social arrangement where we're just going to bring people together. Okay, so it's a group of individuals that come together for a purpose. So for example, at Ford, you come together in perhaps a different division. You could be split based on your geographical location. You could be split based on the type of product that you're making, for example, in the van business and the car business. The Army, you'll also have, the same kind of split, so you'll have different regiments. So again, there'll be a number of different regiments that people will belong to, but it's arranged together, so you come together for a purpose. Controlled performance then just means that performance is going to be monitored as we're going through. Now, if you've got a purpose, if the idea is that you're coming together for a purpose, you obviously need to measure how well you're doing against that purpose. So Ford will come together to produce cars to a high quality standard, and we might be able to measure their performance by looking at number of defects per 100 cars produced, something like that. Now, not only are we going to monitor performance, we're going to be able to adjust performance if necessary. So if we look halfway through the year and we find that we're off track, we need to do something to correct that. Now, you might be a bit more familiar with the idea of for example, a car manufacturer, and we're looking at this. So we'd review costs and quality. So how much are we spending on material? How much material are we using? How many defects are we finding? And then we can try and improve upon that. So we have this constantly evolving standard. With the Army, obviously, very strict disciplinary procedures, and then training to improve things. So a bit more of a strict environment. Okay, the third part of the definition then was thinking about collective goals. So this is the idea that when we bring individuals together, there has to be a goal that everybody is striving for. And the idea is that we put this above the goals that we have for ourselves. So it's really important that you have this kind of collective goal that everybody's pushing towards. And that should hopefully then mean that the individuals that have been brought together, achieve the absolute maximum possible. The goals for a car manufacturer are relatively straightforward: sell cars, make money. Now obviously they'll have lots of smaller goals and objectives that they will break that down into, but that's the overall one. And then obviously the Army is going to have a whole range of goals, so defending the country, defeating the enemy, peacekeeping, all these sorts of things that the Army is responsible for. Finally then we've got the boundary, and this is basically just what tells us, it's what differentiates the organization from everything else around it. So it's what makes us distinct. So for example, you're going to have physical boundaries, so the factory gates for a car factory or the barracks for the Army. But you're also going to have social boundaries. So the fact that you're employed by Ford creates a boundary between you and those that are not employed by Ford. Same with the Army, so you're not really supposed to carry a gun round in the streets if you're not in the Army, so a very distinct difference between the two. Now just in that exercise there, we've seen two very different organisations, and if I were to ask you the difference between the army and Ford, you'd be able to come up with a whole long list of differences. It'd be relatively straightforward. And what you'd find is the differences that you've come up with will probably fit into some of these categories we've got underneath here. So we've just managed to organize these differences, or the common differences that you'll find between two different organizations, and we've categorized them into these different factors. So we'll just have a run through these and just familiarize ourselves with some of them. Okay, so the first way two organizations might differ would be ownership. So for example, you might have one publicly owned company and one privately owned company. So the publicly owned company, or the public sector organization, I should say, would be owned by the nation and managed by the government. So it's trying to achieve things on on behalf of the nation. A private sector company then would be owned by private investors or shareholders, so the people who actually own a share in the business. You'll probably also find a difference in terms of control. So some businesses or some organizations will be run or controlled by the owners themselves. So you might find in a relatively small organization, the owners run the business because it's not really necessary to employ other people to do that for you. You might find as you work your way up a bit to a slightly bigger company, or slightly bigger organization I should say, you might find then that you have people working on their behalf. So the size or the complexity of the organization means that maybe the shareholders don't necessarily have the required skills. And then you've also got the idea that you can have an organization controlled by government-sponsored regulators. So the fact that there are regulators in the background will have an effect on how the organization is run. Now, we've just seen with Ford and the Army a very big difference in terms of what they actually do. So we know exactly what Ford do. They manufacture cars. And we know what the Army do. They, as we saw in the example above there, they defend the country, they defend the enemy, defeat the enemy, and so on. So you might find that you've got a manufacturing organization, you might have a healthcare organization, you might have a service provider, and so on. There's lots and lots of different organizations out there. Over the page there then, we've got whether the organization is a profit-making or non-profit-making organization. So if you've got a business, we use the term business to say, well, that tends to be an organization seeking to make a profit. On the other hand, you have these non-profit making organizations like the Army, for example, or like a charity who have a different purpose. They're not trying to make a profit, they're trying to do something else instead. Size is a relatively easy one, so you can have some small local organizations, some big multinational organizations. Compare your local takeaway to to Ford. Ford's a good example. You'll also have differences in terms of legal status. So are they a company? Are they unincorporated, such as a club or association? Are they a sole trader, so just one person, or are they a partnership, two or more? You got the idea of liability here too, that we need to bring in limited liability and so on, and these are things that we're going to address a bit later in the course. Organizations then will also have different sources of finance, so you could differentiate between two organizations based on what kind of financing they have. So perhaps they finance their operations by selling shares, so they issue shares to people who then have an ownership share of the business, and they raise money. Then they take the money from the new owners and they use that to invest. Or you might find that perhaps they go down the borrowing route, so go to a bank, for example, and taking out a loan. Finally, then we've got technology. Obviously, all organizations, or almost all organizations now, will have some level of technology utilization, but there's still a big difference between, for example, a local grocery store and for example, Sainsbury's. So even two organizations that would effectively be aiming to sell the same goods would still have a massive difference in terms of the level of technology that they use. We'll pick up on section 2 there in the next recording. So if you click stop on this one, move on to the next one, we can